it doesn't matter where we're up to in our life. It doesn't matter what age we are. It doesn't matter how long we've been holding on to stuff. Letting go is letting go. And the freedom we experience having let go feels the same.
Hi, my name's Andy and welcome to Headspace. No, not really. Actually, if you use the app, you're probably not used to seeing me because they keep me locked in a very dark studio. After 7 years, they let me out. And the more I thought about how I wanted to spend my time, the more I thought about how nice it would be to maybe go on a bit of a journey together. The techniques of meditation are just one small part of how to live a healthier and happier life. I feel I can share it in a very different way out here than I can when I'm sitting in the studio. And that's it really. So, here we go.
So, we get a lot of different questions in at Headspace. Sometimes they're very sort of concise and to the point, and sometimes there's a lot of different kind of parts to them. But one that came in the other day that really fascinated me, and it's something that has always kind of fascinated me, is this idea of sort of guilt and regret. I meet so many people who say they are just always caught in that cycle of guilt and regret. And obviously so much of the teaching of meditation, the way we kind of approach meditation, the way we approach life, is about how to be present in the moment. And yet, by definition, if we're caught up in thoughts of guilt and regret, we're living in the past. So it's worth just sort of unpacking that a little bit and seeing maybe, is it possible to live with less guilt, with less regret? Is there a way of sort of letting go of it? And when I read that letter, I was immediately reminded of living in the monastery, and you have a lot of time on your hands in the monastery. There's a lot of time to think about stuff, and it'd be very easy just to sit there and replay things over and over again, feeling bad about the things you might have said or done in your life. And I remember the teacher, at least at our monastery, said, okay, you get a minute. You get a minute of regret. That's it. No more. And kind of trying to understand that at first. Well, how do you do that? We're saying that after a minute we just sort of push the thoughts away, and it's not really like that. I think the point is that regret has its place. I would say guilt arguably has its place as well, but more as a signal, not as a way to kind of beat ourselves up and to criticize ourselves, give ourselves a hard time. I think guilt is the way I see it, the way I sort of live with it in my life is that it's a signal that I've done something that's not in keeping with the way that I would like to live my life. And that signal tells me that there is the possibility that I can learn from that and in the future not repeat that mistake again, if we call it a mistake. So rather than kind of dwelling on it and playing it over and over again, thinking, I wish I could have done it differently. The point here is that if we could have done it differently, we would have done it differently. And then people say, yeah, I know, but I knew there was another way. Well, yeah, we knew there was another way. Intellectually, we knew there was another way. Retrospectively, we knew there was another way. But if we had known as an experience in ourselves in that moment that there was another way, we would have done it in another way. So as much as we might want to beat ourselves up, and in hindsight, we can always look back and in sort of the calm, clear mind that retrospection sometimes brings, we can see that. We have some distance from it and say, yeah, okay, I see what happened there. I got caught up, whatever it might be. But in that moment, we genuinely did the best that we could do. Otherwise, we would have done something more, right? So, and I think it's really helpful to keep that in mind. It's not an excuse. It's not a way of negating harmful things that we might say or do to other people, but it is a way of maintaining a healthy, a happy mind. It's a way of refining an approach to life, kindness, over kind of, or sort of through the moment we're in now and into the future. So I've found that kind of way of thinking about it really helpful, that you get that minute, a minute to reflect on what's happened. How does it feel? Is there something we can learn from it? Is there something we can take into the future? And in doing that, you're able to sort of let go of the past. And unless we're willing, unless we're able to let go of the past, then there is no way of experiencing this moment right now. We are stuck in a storyline from the past. So it's in stepping out of that storyline and letting go of that storyline that we actually get to live again. And I've met people over the years. I've met people who've been living with really deep feelings of guilt and regret. Wow, for not just weeks and months, but years and years. People who've lived decades of their life. And if you'd have asked me kind of a long time ago, is it possible to kind of let go of that many years of regret and guilt? I'm not sure how I would have answered, but in meeting those people so consistently over the years and in experiencing it myself, I'd say absolutely. It's possible. And I've met people who've let go of 40, 50 years of regret and into their 60s and 70s and even 80s, being able to let go of things that they thought they would never be able to let go of. And I feel like if we can, it doesn't matter where we're up to in our life. It doesn't matter what age we are. It doesn't matter how long we've been holding on to stuff. Letting go is letting go. And the freedom we experience having let go feels the same, no matter where we are in our life, no matter how old we are in our life. So I would encourage you not to dwell in guilt and regret, to use guilt as a signal, to give yourself time to pause, to appreciate the feeling, even if that's uncomfortable, and then to let go of that so that you can move on, be present, and live life with a real sense of freedom and ease. So there was one woman that springs to mind actually, and she came to a Headspace event many years ago, a long time ago, and I forget now. I think it was at the end of the event that I was talking to her, and she said that she'd been harboring a sense of not just regret, but a sense of resentment actually for, I think it was almost 40 years. And it had arisen because her husband at the time had an affair with another person, and although she knew about it at the time, kind of let it kind of go on until eventually they went their separate ways. And she said she'd replayed that in her mind every single day, not just once, but multiple times every day for the last 40 years, thinking what might have been, what could have been. Was there any way she could have stopped it, prevented it, foreseen it? Once it was happening, was there any way she could have rectified it or changed the situation in some way? Essentially playing out multiple different stories, which all from the past, nothing that could actually sort of become something real in this present moment. It was all looking to the past, living a life in the past. And she decided to take up meditation. She started using Headspace, and she actually hadn't been using it for a long time, maybe like a couple of months or something. And she said for the first day in her life since that time, she'd gone a day not playing that story in her mind, not caught up in regret, not caught up in feelings of guilt that she might have done something wrong, not caught up in resentment and anger at her husband, her ex-husband. And for me, it was an astonishing thing, actually. One that, as human beings, we can hold on to something for that length of time, replay that storyline over and over until it becomes part of who we are, so completely that we almost forget that we're living in the past. But also the potential for transformation, that as human beings, that we always have the potential to let go of something, even if it's really deep-rooted, even if it feels part of who we are. There is the opportunity and the potential to let that go. And as I say, I've met a lot of people over the years who've talked to me about their feelings of guilt and regret, but yeah, that one stands out. So when I think of the difference between guilt and regret, as I say, for for me personally, the way I experience it, guilt is maybe the perhaps the stronger feeling, the emotional feeling, whereas regret is perhaps more of the rational sort of feeling. So the feeling, the emotional kind of quality, even the physical quality of guilt, I feel it's very tangible. We tend to experience it whenever we think of that situation. Regret tends to be a bit more sort of rational. We start to sort of think, I wish I hadn't done that. Could I have done that differently? And so for me, that's the difference kind of between the two. Guilt is the immediate sort of feeling, that visceral feeling that we feel in our body, that discomfort. It's perhaps more akin to an emotion, whereas, regret, it's a bit more intellectual, perhaps how we justify our feelings of guilt, how we try to rationalize it, or perhaps even how we tend to resist those feelings and sort of move away from them in some way. But that's how I experience the two differently. When I think about different people that I know in my life, that I've met in my life, and my own experience of just sort of watching the mind, it's really easy to get caught in a cycle of regret. And once it sort of takes root, I feel like it's really easy to get sort of stuck in that. It almost becomes part of who we are. We start to apply that same lens to everything. So I think that's the thing very often with the mind. It only takes sort of one situation where we become quite sort of conditioned or habituated to responding, reacting in a particular way. And once we've sort of refined that, it doesn't matter whether it's good or bad, once we sort of refine that, then we start to find ourselves applying that to other situations and areas in life as well. So it's not at all uncommon for people who experience regret over a prolonged period of time for that to become habitual, for it to become conditioned. And that to be the lens that they look at through life. But again, I would always come back to even if that's you, even if it feels as though you can't escape feelings of guilt and regret, I've seen it, I've experienced it firsthand, and I've seen it firsthand. People getting to a point where they're comfortable letting go. And it doesn't mean letting go forever. I think often we think of letting go, it's kind of no longer ever thinking about that thing. That's not it. Of course we're going to think about that thing. Of course we're going to experience thoughts about that thing. It's how often we experience those thoughts, and when those thoughts arise, how much we're going to get overwhelmed by them or caught up in them. So I think to begin with, this is how I have experienced. I can only talk about my own experience, but maybe there's something that I feel a deep sense of regret about. To begin with, it's just like a loosening. Like there's still a sense of regret there, but maybe it doesn't create sort of such a strong emotion. And then over time, the thought perhaps visits a little bit less. To begin with, when the thought arises, there's still enough interest by the mind. So the mind still wants to buy into it, still wants to give itself a hard time, to criticize, to be unkind to itself. And then over time, it starts to get less interested in doing that. Again, it loosens a bit more. The thoughts become a little less frequent. Each time, I feel like there's that sort of connection. Less frequent, less involved, and over time, that loosens up. In time, I think there is a real possibility that we can experience the thought of what happened, and yet we don't get caught up in it. We don't feel overwhelmed by it, and we don't end up thinking about it. We are able to see it, to let it go, and just to continue with whatever we're doing at the time. So people often ask me whether I have regrets myself. Of course, there are things in the past that, in hindsight, in retrospect, I wish I had done differently. And, whether it was things that I said or things that I did. And of course, with a magic wand, if I could go back, and change those things, of course, we all would, right? Because we all want people around us to be happier. But I don't really kind of relate to it in that way. I think there is a a point at which the mind is comfortable letting go of the past. Doesn't mean we forget those things that happened in the past. I don't forget those things that I said or I did. But I don't find myself sitting around thinking about them. They don't keep me up at night. I feel that the mind has found a rhythm or a cadence where it's more comfortable kind of being present. Again, doesn't mean there weren't lots of things that happened in the past that I haven't regretted at some point. And it doesn't mean that those things no longer matter. I still will go to those places in my mind because those are places of learning for me. So I go there not to beat myself up, not to give myself a hard time, but to remind myself of what happens, what the consequences are when I do something or say something which I could perhaps approach in a different way. So for me, it's more of a learning on the journey rather than a place to beat myself up or give myself a hard time. I recently met someone who was, they were working the program, as they say, kind of doing 12 steps, kind of substance abuse. And they were going through the process of listing down all the things they regretted in their life, all the people that they'd hurt in their life, and trying to sort of make restitution, to go around and visit them and, or call them or write to them. And what struck me, and I remember we did something not terribly kind of dissimilar in the monastery. The only difference was we wrote it all down and then we just burnt it. And that sounds quite sort of uncaring in a way. That's not the idea. It was more a point of being able to sort of, again, another way of letting go of that stuff. And also there was no phone, there was no email. And you couldn't leave the monastery. So there was no way of visiting those people, even if you wanted to. But it reminded me of something quite recently. And a chap came up to me and he said, I hadn't seen him for a few years, And he said, I don't know if you remember, he said, but we were chatting about 5 or 6 years ago and, such and such a place. And he said, I said this thing and I felt bad about it ever since. I'm like, wow, what did you say? And he told me, and I'm like, I have no memory of that. And for him, he had lived with that for all those years and thought about it, and it had become this kind of thing. I didn't even remember it. I think very often things that we kind of take away, that we feel guilty about, that we feel regretful about, for the other person, it's maybe not even such, it's not such a big part of their life. That said, there are unquestionably situations where I think we have a responsibility to go to the other person and to apologize, to own kind of whatever it is that we've done. And I think that is part of the letting go sort of process, not necessarily harboring a sense of regret or guilt. So there are situations for sure where that can be helpful, but more often than not, we don't need to set about sort of contacting every single person in our life that we might have hurt in some way. I think it's enough to be really clear in our intention moving forwards that we're going to do our best to practice kindness, awareness, compassion, however you like to think about it. So I think sometimes this idea of regret or guilt, it can come about. In fact, this was part of the question that came in. It was, how do we deal with letting ourselves down, and perhaps we feel regretful sort of retrospectively. I feel like we can only let ourselves down if we have a very clear expectation of what we're setting out to achieve or do or say or whatever it might be. Because letting down is a point of comparison. So it's sort of this compared to that. I think generally in life, if we have a very fixed expectation, then we're kind of setting ourselves up for failure or disappointment to some extent. We're all human, we're all just trying to work this out. We're on a journey, and it's a shared journey. But along the way, we're gonna things are going to happen. We're going to do things. We're going to say things that don't necessarily meet with the way that we would like to live life. And I think that's the importance of living moment to moment. If we're living really fixated on an expectation, then it's an expectation that was formed in the past. We can't have an expectation now, that's for the future. So if we're trying to compare ourselves against an expectation in the past, we're essentially living in the past. And we've set that expectation. No one else has set that expectation. Others can project things onto us, but that's up to us, kind of how much we want to sort of take that on board. So I feel in many ways the essence of living in the moment, of living kind of in the present, is letting go of expectations, letting go of that point of comparison where we can compare ourselves against an idea in our mind of what we would like life to be, and instead actually live life as it is.